2020 was the year many Americans and Europeans and Icelanders came face to face with isolation for the first time in their lives. Some found it to be an intolerable experience. In this commercial, Promote Iceland offers to take your recorded screams of frustration and broadcast them into a place of even greater isolation. It's supposed to be some sort of therapy. So just how uncomfortable are you with solitude? And have you been with solitude? In my first voluntary quarantine location, I never wanted to scream, either at home or outside. The place where I was a place some people might find unnervingly quiet. There was no traffic, there were no planes overhead, no cell signal. It was silent. There was a little wind, there was a flowing creek, there were songbirds. Now, are there ways to use solitude to our advantage? To honestly evaluate ourselves, to assess ourselves? I believe there are. Quiet thinking can be idleness, or it can be productive assessment. Getting honest with oneself isn't easy. It takes discipline, it takes focus, it takes concentration. But most useful of all to you will be humility and purpose. Let me give you a good reason to get honest with yourself. If your goal is to have a meaningful life with meaningful relationships and meaningful, purposeful things to do with other people and for other people, you need to know what personal obstacles or personal vices might be standing in your way. Vices which will really mess up your life, like pride, cynicism, bitterness, arrogance, self-centeredness, greed, laziness. These things are poison to you. You need the discernment to know who you really are, because very soon you'll need some highly refined discernment to know who others are. And I mean the average folks in your neighborhood. When social conditions begin to resemble the Wild West, how's your discernment? When police protection is largely gone, when store shelves become empty, when rioters get closer, you'll need to know who your friends are and who your enemies are. Can you discern this? Average folks who look fairly normal in times of peace can revert to deadly vices simply to stay alive. Can you spot the truly beneficial people in your community? The people who will be dependable, hardworking, team players, the ones with character and skills and sympathy for others. In your neighborhood, can you distinguish between these four types of people? The neutral folks, men who are genuine threats, people who will be trustworthy allies, and others who are simply so scared they could do foolish or rash things. Now is the time to sharpen your discernment, your situational awareness, your neighborhood awareness. Remember that guy who bragged on Facebook about how he snitched on somebody for breaking an unconstitutional executive order? How about that lazy guy who's been taking a sudden and noticeable interest in your garden and in your chickens? How about that Karen woman who demands that everything in the neighborhood be fair and really wants to take a tally of everything, people and water and supplies and guns and groceries and anything that concerns her? Or the neighborhood bully who stretches the bounds of civility just a little bit more every day? You'll never be able to distinguish good character from weak character until you can get really brutally honest with your own character shortcomings. Quiet, undistracted reflection can be exactly what you need if you can take full advantage of real solitude, which is not simply the absence of noise or media. It's the ability to be totally alone with your own attitude, with your mind, with your heart, and with your soul. Solitude can really make you or ruin you, depending on what you do with it. Like that young Russian attorney in the Chekhov story. And you can tell me in the comments below if you think he had humility and purpose. This is what I'm getting at in this video. What you really need to help you is humility and purpose. That is the only way you'll be able to master and take advantage of solitude. Do you have it? Did this young Russian attorney have it? If you don't know the story, let me relate it. But let's take a walk and I'll tell you the story. Come on, girl, let's go. So once upon a time, there was a young Russian, 25 years old, and he was invited to a grand and magnificent banquet at the home of one of Moscow's richest bankers. And it was a grand affair, and a dinner like he'd never seen before. And then discussion like he'd never heard before around the fireplace after dinner. And so all the great men of the city were there, and they talked about many subjects. But then conversation turned to the death penalty. And they discussed back and forth what would be the most civilized form of punishment for criminals who committed capital crimes. And they said, this country, Russia, we want it to be a civilized Christian country, and we just think that the death penalty is a kind of cruel, unusual punishment that needs to be done away with. We prefer and we recommend life imprisonment. And the discussion raged back and forth because there were many men who were still advocating for capital punishment. And they stopped and they asked the host of the evening, "What is your opinion?" And he said, "Well, if you think about it, if you put a man into prison for life, you're actually killing him by degrees. And that's the most cruel and unusual punishment of all." He said, because men simply cannot take solitude. So he said, "I recommend we keep it as it is, and that we kill a man all at once, execute him if he's committed a capital crime." And then they turned to the young lawyer who'd not said anything. He was just listening. They said, "Young man, what is your opinion? You're an attorney. You're a student of the law. What do you recommend?" And the young man said, "Well, I believe that if I was the one who was convicted, I wouldn't like either option. But I would take, if I could choose, I would take life in prison, because I would be able to tolerate that. I would be able to make something of my life. I would be able to redeem the years that I'm stuck in prison." And the banker said, "Young man, you're foolish. You're a foolish 25-year-old. There's no way you would be able to take 1 year, maybe even 2 years. You would not be able to do it." And they argued back and forth. The young man said, "Of course I could. I would know how to handle this. I would know how to take this. I would know what to do with my years." The banker said, "You're a fool." He said, "I would wager that you would not be able to take even 2 years of it." The young man said, "Well, how much would you wager?" And the banker said, "I would raise," he thought about it, "I'll wager 2 million rubles that you couldn't take 5 years in solitary confinement." And the young lawyer said, "I could take 5 years, and I'll take your wager. In fact, I'll triple down on your wager. I will wager 15 years of my life to prove you wrong, that I could stay there, I could handle solitude, and I would be able to endure it." And all the men were aghast in the room. And the banker said, "You're on, I'll take it. 2 million rubles for 15 years of your life." And so the great men of the town who were there gathered together. They drew up the terms of the bet and the wager, and it was to start that very night. The young man would go into a little cottage on the estate of the banker. He would have access to communication, but only one-way communication outside. He could send letters, he could send requests for special kinds of food. The food would be brought to him. Any books that he wanted, musical instruments, but he could not receive any information, and he could not have any kind of communication with anyone in the outside world, even the guards who were around him, who would bring him his requests and take his notes of request to the banker who would fulfill them. So it started that night, and to make a long story short, he endured 2 years, and then 5 years, and then 10 years. And everyone was astounded. The banker was astounded. What the young man did with his time, he invested it in reading. Inside the cottage was a small library, but the young man requested then some additional 500, 600 books. He learned many languages. There was a piano in the cottage. He learned music. He learned to play the piano. He learned to master the piano. He asked for other musical instruments. Those were provided to him. And he kept going within this confinement of his. And finally, toward the end of the 15-year period, something happened to the banker. On the Russian stock exchange, he had lost his fortune. And he realized that the young attorney was about to complete his end of the bargain and stay there for the full 15 years, requiring the banker to satisfy the terms of the bet. And if he had given that $2 million, he would have been ruined. He knew that. He commiserated. He planned. He didn't know what to do. And finally, he came up with a plan, the only plan he could think of. I need to sneak into the cottage before the term is up, and I need to murder the young man. He found the key to the door that had been locked for 15 years, and the night before the term was up, he did sneak into the cottage. He found the young man slumped over a table with a lit candle next to it. The young man was now 40 years old. He was emaciated. He had long hair. He had a long beard, and he was sound asleep. And before the banker murdered him, he stopped to read a letter that the young man had been writing. And in the letter, the young man said, "What I have learned in all this time, in all the wisdom that I've gained, in all the books that I've studied, I really despise the things that you live for, and I don't want any part of it." And he was committed to prove, again, make another point with his life, that 5 minutes before the term was up, he would open the doors, sneak out, climb over the wall, and disappear, and annul the terms of the agreement, because he didn't want any of this rich banker's dirty money. It's what he had concluded. And so the banker, in reading this, realized, well, I'm off the hook. And so he crept back out of the cottage, and sure enough, that's what the young man did. 5 minutes before the term was up, he climbed over the wall. He snuck out of the cottage, he climbed over the wall, and he disappeared forever. And that's the story of the young Russian attorney. Now, what can we learn from the life of this young Russian attorney? So what had Solitude done for this young man? It gave him a kind of wisdom that hit a dead end, because he did not apply humility or purpose to his situation. The vast wisdom that he learned had no earthly application, at least that he knew of. He could hold it in his mind, but he had no idea how to use it in his needy world, and so thus it was just futile knowledge. It was vain. It was all vanity and striving after wind, because it was not used in the service of God or other people. So he concluded in his letter, I don't want to live as you do. I don't want the money you live by. I don't want any of the stuff that you have. I don't want this way of life that you've built for yourself. And it was true that the banker was living for selfish folly, his own selfish aggrandizement and the accumulation of wealth for wealth's sake. But the young lawyer's solution, too, was just as foolish. It was just as much folly, just lacking just as much in wisdom. So to renounce all wisdom was not the right thing to do. To renounce all tools of life, all freedom, all responsibility, and to run away from it all into yet more selfish solitude was not the answer. This too was vanity, and it should have been turned away from, but his wisdom was nothing but just vast knowledge disconnected from wisdom and purpose, and we can learn from this. So our goals in life should not be indolence or an absence of responsibility, or learning for just the fun of it, or wasting our lives for the fun of it, or even the obtaining of great wisdom as a goal in itself. Wisdom and knowledge and money and friendships are always vain, and will always be vain and futile unless we can use them in helping others live meaningful lives. And along the way, seeking and finding truth and eternal security that's available in the Christian faith and always has been. Americans once held this idea as a cultural impulse, and they were not ashamed of it. They were active and deliberate about building what they called an orderly Christian civilization, and it started with orderly thinking. They could handle evenings of quiet reading and thinking, not just during quarantine, but all the time. And this says something about them. And it says something about us that we have trouble with it. Solitude was a regular feature of life before radio and television, and it can be too in our lives voluntarily if we just reorder our lives in this constructive way. So here's how you can invest your next months of silence and solitude. Just start by inquiring honestly, really get honest with yourself. How do others see me? What are my greatest weaknesses? What are my biggest regrets? What have I always known as a good and right thing to do and failed so far in doing it? What have I allowed into my mind as continual distraction? What should I be thinking about that is creative and constructive? What disciplines can I apply to my life right now? What can I work on that can set me apart as a leader? This last topic is what I'm really looking forward to exploring in great detail on this channel with you. If you come along with me, get involved in this community. Thank you for joining us.